The morning after we buried Eli, I woke up before the sun came in. I lay in the same bed I had shared with him for 6 years, the same quilt, the same floorboards that creaked when you stepped too close to the window. And the first thought I had was not grief. It was a question. A question I had been carrying for so long inside my chest that I had forgotten it was still there. And that question, and what I found when I finally answered it honestly, is the reason I am sitting here telling you this story now. Because what I discovered the morning after I buried my husband was not what I expected. And I think if you stay with me until the end, you will understand why it changed everything I thought I knew about love, about God, and about the life I had been living. Before we go any further, there is something I want to say from the heart. More than 90% of the people watching right now have not subscribed yet. And perhaps that would not matter so much if these stories were just words, but they are not. They are pieces of real lives, pieces of moments that no one warned us about and no one prepared us for. So if you have ever found yourself in a story like this one, if you have ever felt something you were not given language for, please take a moment to subscribe. It is completely free, and it helps this community continue growing. And while you are here, I want to know, what feeling brought you to this video tonight? Tell me in the comments below. My name inside the community was Hannah Stoltz, and I was 23 when I left. But this story begins before that. It begins 3 weeks after Eli's funeral, when I sat at the small kitchen table in my rental house and asked myself the question I had never been allowed to ask out loud when he was alive. Did I love him? I want you to understand why that question was so complicated. I want you to understand what it means to love someone you were never asked if you wanted, in a world where the word love was not used the way English people use it, where love was not a feeling you waited for, but a duty you performed, a field you tended, a thing that grew or did not grow in the dark without anyone speaking its name. I want you to understand all of that before I tell you what I found. Because what I found the morning after I buried Eli was not a simple answer. It was something much harder and much more honest than that. Eli died on a Tuesday in late October, a farming accident. The neighbor who found him said it must have been very fast. I was told this by a woman named Ruth who had known Eli his whole life and who called me from a phone she had borrowed from the hardware store because she did not own one herself. She said, "Hannah, Eli is gone." And she said it the way Amish people say hard things, plainly, without softening. The way you would say the rain is coming or the crop did not make it this year. She said it and then she was quiet, and I stood in my rental kitchen with my English phone pressed against my ear, and I felt something I still cannot fully name. Not the crashing grief I had read about in books. Something more like a door being closed very slowly in a very quiet house. I had left the community 4 years earlier. The shunning had come quickly after that. My parents stopped answering my letters within the first year. My sister Emma, who used to braid my hair on Sunday mornings, looked through me at the market the one time we passed each other. The community does not call shunning cruelty. They call it love, a loving pressure to bring the lost one home. But I had not come home, and Eli, in his own quiet way, had never fully shunned me. Here is the thing you need to know about Eli that no one in the community ever talked about. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who made himself big in a room. He was the kind of man who noticed when the lamp was getting low before you did, and quietly filled it without saying anything. The kind of man who, when he saw you needed to cry, did not leave the room. He had large, careful hands and a habit of pressing his lips together when he was thinking about something difficult. And I had watched that face for 6 years before I ever learned what was actually going on behind it. We had been matched by our parents when I was 17. I have told that story in another video. The announcement in the kitchen, the bread I was making, the way my mother said it as though she was reading from a list. I have told it, and I will not repeat all of it now. But I want you to know, because it matters for what comes after, that I did not choose Eli, and he did not choose me. We were handed to each other by two families who believed they were doing the right thing, and we made the best of what we were handed. That is not a love story in the English sense, but it is a true story, and sometimes true stories are worth more. What I found on our wedding night was not what I expected either. I have told that part too, the part where I cried. The part where Eli said, "I know, Hannah, they did not ask me either." The part where we lay side by side under my grandmother's quilt, fully clothed, and talked until the lamp burned low. That night is the reason everything that came after was possible. Because Eli made a decision in that room without any instruction, without any map, without any community elder telling him how to treat a frightened 17-year-old girl in a bed she had not chosen. He decided to be kind. Not because kindness was required, because it was what he had in him. And I have thought about that in the years since. What it costs a person to be kind in a world that does not ask for it. In a world where no one would have blamed him, and no one would have known. He was kind anyway, in the dark, when no one was watching. In therapy, I later learned the word for that, integrity. Not the public kind, the private kind. The kind that lives in lamplight rooms when the house is sleeping. The 6 years we were married were not easy years. I want to be honest about that, because I think the way we tell stories sometimes smooths out the parts that were actually the most important. There were months when we barely spoke beyond what was necessary. There was a winter when I stopped eating properly, and Eli watched me from across the table and did not know how to reach me, and I did not know how to let him. There was a season after I had a miscarriage, our only pregnancy, when the grief sat between us in the bed like a third body. We were not a perfect couple. We were two people who had been given to each other and were trying to make something real out of what they had been handed. And sometimes we did, and sometimes we did not. That is the truth. What grew between us in those 6 years was something quieter than love, a partnership, a friendship, an understanding of each other's silences that felt more intimate than anything I had ever seen the older couples perform on Sundays. I knew which creak in the floorboards meant Eli could not sleep. He knew which way I held my shoulders when I was about to cry. We had learned each other the way you learn a house you have lived in a long time, not dramatically, just slowly. When I finally told Eli I needed to leave the community, he was the one who already knew. He had known before I said it. We were in the kitchen in the early morning, before the day began, and I sat down across from him and started to say it. And he looked up from his coffee and he said, "I know, Hannah." He said it the same way he had said it on our wedding night, quietly, without accusation. He said, "I know. Tell me what you need." And I told him, and he listened. And then he said he could not come with me because he could not leave his faith and his family and his land, and he was not asking me to stay. He said both of those things in the same quiet voice, and I understood that he meant both of them. He drove me to the bus station in the dark before sunrise so that no one would see. He stood on the platform in his plain coat with his hat in his hands and hugged me for a long time without saying anything. When he finally pulled back, his face was wet. He said, "You were always too much for this place, Hannah." Not a criticism and not a compliment, just a fact. And then he turned and walked back to his truck, and I watched his taillights disappear into the dark, and I got on the bus. After I left, the cards came, twice a year, no return address, my name in his careful handwriting. Nothing else inside, just my name on the envelope. The reminder that somewhere in that world, one person still knew where I was and had not decided to forget me. I kept every one in a shoebox under my bed. 14 cards over 7 years. The last one arrived 6 weeks before Ruth called. White envelope, my name, nothing inside. I held it for a long time before I put it in the box, the way you hold something when part of you suspects it might be the last one. I put it in the box. I went to sleep. 6 weeks later, he was gone. Now I need to tell you about the morning after the funeral, because this is where the story turns. This is the part I have not told before. The burial was small. I stood at a distance because I was not fully welcomed in, and I did not want to cause a scene on the day they were putting Eli in the ground. I watched from the edge of the field in my English coat, which was the wrong thing to wear, and I had known that when I put it on, but I did not own anything plainer anymore. I watched them lower the simple wooden box into the earth. I watched Eli's uncle, who was now very old, stand at the head of the grave with his hat pressed to his chest. I watched the men fill in the earth with shovels, the way Amish funerals go, everyone participating, no one hiring out the hard part. I watched until it was finished. And then I walked back to my rental car, and I drove to the motel I had booked in the next town over, because there was no one in the community who would have offered me a room. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the motel bed with the curtain open a crack and watched the parking lot lights and thought about the shoebox and the 14 envelopes and the fact that there would not be a 15th. I thought about the lamp on our wedding night, his hands, his taillights going away in the dark. And I thought about the question, the one I had never answered, the one that had lived inside my chest so long I had stopped noticing it was there. Did I love him? The next morning I woke up early, earlier than I had intended. The parking lot was gray and quiet, and somewhere outside a bird was making noise in the way birds do before the light comes fully. And I lay there in that motel bed, and I let the question come up again. And this time, I did not push it back down. I let it sit in the room with me like a presence. I let it be there. And I waited for my own answer, the way Eli had once waited for mine on a different morning, in a different room, a very long time ago. What I found was not what I expected. I had spent years in therapy learning to name what had been done to me: coercive consent, arranged marriage, the suppression of a young girl's voice by a system that called it holiness. I had spent years untangling what I actually felt from what I had been told to feel. And when I finally let myself answer honestly, here is what I found. I did not love Eli the way the songs describe. I did not love him with the urgent, desperate hunger of the novels I had read in secret. I did not love him the way the English world taught me love was supposed to feel. But I loved him. I loved him the way you love the one person in a room who saw you clearly and did not look away. I loved him the way you love someone who made a private promise to you in the dark and kept it for 6 years without ever being asked to. I loved him the way you love someone who carries your name on an envelope twice a year for 7 years after you are gone, not to call you back, not to ask for anything, just to let you know that you are still known. That is a kind of love. It is a quieter kind than most people talk about, but I do not think it is a lesser kind. Here is what I know now, 1 year after the morning after I buried Eli. The life I was handed was not the life I would have chosen. What was done to me at 17 was wrong, and no amount of grace inside it changes that. The system that arranged my marriage and shunned me for leaving valued obedience over truth, and I have spent years healing from it. All of that is still true. And I also know this: inside that system, in a small, lamplit room, a quiet young man decided to treat a frightened girl with dignity when he had no instruction to do so and no one to hold him accountable. He made that decision and kept it, and it shaped the next 6 years and the 7 after that and the rest of my life. He did not save me. I left on my own. I built my own life on my own. But he held a door open at a moment when every other door was closing. And that is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The morning after I buried Eli, I got up from that motel bed and stood in the parking lot in the gray light and breathed the cold air. And I thought about what it means to grieve someone you were never supposed to love in the first place. What it means to mourn a life given to you without consent that held inside all its wrongness something real, something you made together in the dark from nothing, without a map, without permission. I thought about the girl I was at 17, with flour on her hands and no voice in the room. What she deserved and did not get. And what she got anyway, in spite of everything, because of one quiet man who waited and said, I know. If you grew up somewhere that made your choices for you, I see you. If you have ever loved someone in a way that did not have the right name for it, and lost them, and stood somewhere at dawn trying to understand what you are actually grieving, I see you. You are allowed to grieve the complicated things. You are allowed to say it was wrong and it was also real. Both of those things can live in the same chest. I know because I carry them both every day. Before you leave, I want to thank you for staying with me until the very end. I know there are millions of videos you could have watched today, Yet you spent these moments here. But there is one thing I noticed recently. More than 90% of the people who watch these videos still have not subscribed. So if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of someone, somewhere, or some feeling you thought you had forgotten, I hope you will subscribe. It is free, and it helps these stories continue. And before you go, tell me, what part of this story stayed with you the longest? I would love to read your thoughts below. The life handed to you is not the only life you are allowed to feel. The love that found you anyway was real.